that some believe the authorities have failed and those in power accused of
There's been a lot said about me.
The state should do nothing.
failing to protect our citizens.
What if everything
We can change history.
Citizen Vigilante. After decades of cinema chronicling men taking the law into their own hands when the system fails them, a thoughtful reckoning is warranted, if not necessary, about the costs and complex morality of vigilantism. The vigilante film has been a staple of American and international cinema since the medium's earliest days, offering audiences the vicarious thrill of watching someone bypass bureaucratic red tape and corrupt institutions to deliver swift, decisive justice. From the westerns of the 1950s to the urban revenge thrillers of the 1970s and 80s, these films have consistently explored the tension between civilization's rules and our primal desire for retribution. A handful of films have tried to genuinely interrogate this impulse, with varying degrees of success. Martin Scorsese's Taxi Driver presented vigilantism as the manifestation of a diseased mind. Clint Eastwood's later work, particularly Unforgiven, deconstructed the mythology he himself had helped create with the Dirty Harry series. More recently, films like Blue Ruin and Cold in July have examined the cascading consequences of revenge with nuance and intelligence. But when one of the world's most popular comic book characters is Batman, critiquing extrajudicial heroism feels like tilting at windmills. The cultural saturation of vigilante heroes, from comic books to prestige television, has normalized the concept to such a degree that any serious critique risks being dismissed as humorless or contrarian. We live in an age where costumed billionaires beating up street criminals are treated as aspirational figures rather than symptoms of systemic failure. Yet Uwe Boll's Citizen Vigilante, whose original title somewhat ironically was The Dark Knight, manages to be so indulgent and incurious a portrait of a man exacting vengeance that calling it wish fulfillment feels irresponsible. This is not merely a bad film that fails to engage with its subject matter. It is an actively harmful piece of propaganda that weaponizes legitimate concerns about justice and victimization in service of the most base and xenophobic impulses. Uwe Boll, A Career of Cinematic Disasters. To understand the spectacular failure of Citizen Vigilante, one must first understand the unique position Uwe Boll occupies in contemporary cinema. Boll, a cinematic embarrassment since the early 2000s, here delivers a violent, incoherent, morally bankrupt slice of exploitation on the same qualitative level as House of the Dead, Alone in the Dark, and Blood Rain. The German director has achieved something remarkable in his career, a perfect record of critical failure spanning more than 2 decades. His video game adaptations have become legendary for their incompetence, with House of the Dead featuring inexplicable inserts of actual video game footage during action sequences, Alone in the Dark, beginning with several minutes of incomprehensible text crawl, and Blood Rain, wasting a cast including Ben Kingsley, Michelle Rodriguez, and Kristanna Loken on medieval vampire nonsense. Boll's films typically exploit tax loopholes and pre-sales to international markets to secure financing, allowing him to continue making films despite universal critical condemnation and audience indifference. His defenders, and he has a few, argue that his later films showed some growth as a filmmaker, with politically charged dramas like Rampage and Assault on Wall Street, demonstrating a crude but occasionally effective anger at systemic injustice. Citizen Vigilante proves that any such growth was an illusion. This film represents Boll at his absolute worst, technically incompetent, narratively incoherent, and morally repugnant. In fact, the film is so astonishingly bad, it almost feels like the writer-director-producer is deliberately sabotaging his star Armie Hammer, whose intended comeback can only be harmed by this project. Armie Hammer's ill-advised comeback vehicle. The casting of Armie Hammer in the lead role adds another layer of unfortunate context to Citizen Vigilante. Once positioned as a rising leading man following strong performances in The Social Network, Call Me By Your Name, and The Criminally Underseen, The Man from U.N.C.L.E., Hammer's career collapsed following allegations of sexual misconduct and the revelation of disturbing private messages. Hammer plays Sanders, an American living abroad in a country that, according to him, has been overrun by criminal migrants. For an actor attempting to rehabilitate his public image following accusations of predatory behavior, choosing to play a violent vigilante who targets marginalized communities seems like spectacularly poor judgment. The optics alone should have given pause to anyone involved in the production. The choice becomes even more mystifying when one considers the quality of the material. This is not a prestige project from an acclaimed filmmaker that might allow Hammer to demonstrate serious acting chops and earn critical reconsideration. This is a Uwe Boll film, a director whose work is synonymous with failure. One struggles to understand what Hammer's representatives were thinking when they signed off on this project, unless they somehow believed that any work was better than no work at all. A plot without geography or logic. The narrative such as it exists in Citizen Vigilante is frustratingly vague in its specifics. A title card splashes Europe across the screen in capital letters, but without further geographical context, it's difficult to know which accented character actors are good guys and which are bad. This geographical vagueness is not artful ambiguity. It's lazy filmmaking that allows Boll to traffic in xenophobic stereotypes without committing to any specific cultural or political context. Is this Berlin, Paris, Prague, Budapest? Each of these cities has distinct architecture, culture, and contemporary political situations that would inform the story being told. But Boll cannot be bothered with such specifics. Europe is presented as a monolithic entity, a once great civilization now supposedly being destroyed by foreign invaders. This reductive view mirrors the rhetoric of far-right political movements across the continent, and the film's refusal to engage with actual complexity or nuance reveals its true nature as propaganda rather than drama. Sanders' identity is a secret, much to the consternation of Interpol chief Henry Costas Mandylor. The cat-and-mouse dynamic between vigilante and detective is a staple of the genre, seen in everything from Dirty Harry to The Dark Knight, the actual one. But here, the pursuit lacks any sense of stakes or urgency. Henry is supposedly hunting a serial killer who broadcasts his crimes online, yet he seems to approach the investigation with all the intensity of someone looking for misplaced car keys. But he has become a viral sensation worldwide, watching influencers sing his praises when he's not recording blurred face manifestos about a legal system that protects criminals and re-traumatizes victims. This element of the story, the social media amplification of vigilantism, could have been the foundation for an interesting commentary on our contemporary moment, where algorithm-driven radicalization and performative justice dominate our discourse. Instead, Boll treats the viral nature of Sanders' crimes as simple validation of his righteousness. The influencers who praise him are presented without irony or critique, their support framed as evidence of popular will rather than the kind of mob mentality that has led to harassment campaigns, doxing, and real-world violence. The economics of revenge. Funding his acts of revenge with the rent he extracts from tenants in a network of properties inherited from his late father, Sanders controls his family business with the same exactitude that he judges evildoers. This detail is one of the film's most accidentally revealing elements. Sanders is not a working-class everyman driven to desperate measures. He is a wealthy property owner, a member of the capitalist class who funds his hobby of killing people with passive income extracted from those who actually work for a living. The irony is apparently lost on Boll, but it speaks volumes about the film's politics. Sanders represents exactly the kind of entitled privilege that actual progressive politics seeks to dismantle: inherited wealth, unearned power, and the assumption that one's personal sense of righteousness justifies any action. He is Batman without the self-awareness, a landlord playing judge, jury, and executioner while collecting rent checks. But after a chance encounter at a bar where Sanders is the owner, Henry finds himself one step closer to apprehending this mysterious avenging angel, even if the local citizens are supportive enough of his activities that they don't seem to want him caught. Again, Sanders' economic position is emphasized. He doesn't just own rental properties, he owns commercial real estate as well. He is a man of substantial means who has chosen vigilantism not out of desperation or trauma, but seemingly out of ideological commitment and personal preference. The vigilante film canon and where Citizen Vigilante fails. No matter how much affection one may have for vigilante films, from genre standard bearers like Dirty Harry, Taxi Driver, and Rolling Thunder, to any of a dozen Jason Statham actioners, Boll makes it extremely difficult to be charitable to Citizen Vigilante, even as the cheapest grindhouse fare. Let's examine what makes those canonical vigilante films work, and where Citizen Vigilante fails by comparison. Dirty Harry presented Harry Callahan as a deeply flawed individual operating in a broken system, and while the film's politics are questionable by contemporary standards, it at least acknowledged the moral compromises its protagonist was making. Taxi Driver is explicitly about mental illness and urban alienation, with Travis Bickle presented as a disturbed individual rather than a hero. Rolling Thunder channeled post-Vietnam trauma into a revenge narrative that felt genuinely cathartic while acknowledging the psychic damage of violence. Even disposable B-action films typically understand the importance of pacing, clear action geography, and giving the audience a rooting interest in the protagonist's success. The Jason Statham vehicle's Boll's film superficially resembles at least deliver competent fight choreography, propulsive editing, and a star performance that demonstrates commitment to the material. Citizen Vigilante offers none of this. It is pointlessly nonlinear, and really has no plot except for Sanders to persuade victims of violent crimes that his form of punishment will be more cathartic than what the legal system can provide, and then enacted with as much firepower and brutality as possible. The nonlinear structure serves no purpose. It doesn't reveal character, create suspense, or comment on the cyclical nature of violence. It simply makes the film harder to follow without offering any compensatory benefits. Boll seems to use every second of footage he recorded on the film, often multiple times, to pad it to feature length, as if he watched Hitchcock's Vertigo, and decided that following actors through every single moment of an activity somehow imbues it with the meaning his script clearly lacks. The comparison to Vertigo, one of cinema's masterpieces, is of course absurd, but it's worth noting that Hitchcock's following of Kim Novak through San Francisco serves multiple purposes. It builds suspense, establishes geographical space, and reflects the obsessive psychology of James Stewart's character. When Boll shows us Sanders walking down hallways, driving from location to location, or engaging in mundane activities, it serves only to fill runtime. There is no psychological depth being revealed, no thematic significance to the repetition. It is simply padding, the desperate attempt of a filmmaker who shot insufficient material to reach feature length and must therefore stretch what he has to the breaking point. Performances that range from misguided to sleepwalking. Hammer's character is as xenophobic and entitled as the broadest American stereotype, gnashing his teeth over foreign bogeymen and wagging his silencer-ed handgun at perceived offenders while delivering self-righteous monologues about the downstream societal repercussions of criminality. The dialogue Boll has written sounds like it was pulled from the comment section of right-wing news websites, filled with talking points about criminal migrants, soft on crime policies, and the victimization of real citizens. Even if the actor's private behavior has rendered him largely unhearable in the US, Hammer was at least a skilled and charismatic performer at his career peak, and little of that spark is visible as he recites Boll's prejudiced screeds. In The Social Network, Hammer demonstrated perfect comic timing and the ability to convey privilege without becoming completely unlikable. In Call Me By Your Name, he showed genuine warmth and vulnerability. In The Man from U.N.C.L.E., he proved he could anchor an action film with old-school movie star charisma.
All of that ability has apparently abandoned him here, though one can hardly blame the actor entirely. The material is so poor, the character so thinly written, that Daniel Day-Lewis himself would struggle to find anything to play beyond the surface-level rage and self-righteousness. Hammer recites his lines with a mechanical quality, as if he's reading from cue cards just off camera and cannot muster the enthusiasm to pretend otherwise. Meanwhile, Mandylor exudes a world weariness that neither he nor Boll ever pairs with any sense of urgency to catch an enigmatic killer who leaves behind so much evidence in his wake, from fingerprints to recorded videos featuring his thinly disguised face and voice, that it seems harder not to find him. Costas Mandylor is a veteran character actor who has appeared in everything from the Saw franchise to prestige television, and he's usually a reliable presence even in subpar material. Here, however, he seems to be sleepwalking through the production, delivering his lines with the enthusiasm of someone reading a phone book. His character is supposed to be obsessed with catching Sanders, but Mandylor plays every scene with the same low-energy indifference. Again, the writing gives him nothing to work with. Henry has no personal stake in the investigation, no character traits beyond his job title, no arc or development across the runtime. The supporting cast fares no better, with various accented performers appearing briefly to either be victimized or to victimize others, with minimal characterization to distinguish one from another. Boll seems uninterested in crafting actual characters, instead populating his film with crude archetypes: the suffering victim, the irredeemable criminal, the ineffectual bureaucrat. The Landlord, an accidentally perfect alternative title. After being legally prohibited from using its original, DC-inspired title, one wonders why Boll chose such a bland, nondescript title when The Landlord was right there. Sanders is so committed to his responsibilities as a property owner that he stops a liaison with a sex worker mid-thrust to scold her about the mold growing on the walls above her bed. This scene is perhaps the film's single most revealing moment, encapsulating everything wrong with the project in one excruciating sequence. Sanders is engaged in a purely transactional sexual encounter, already establishing him as someone who views other people as commodities to be purchased, when he notices property damage in one of his rental units. His response is to interrupt the sexual act to berate the woman about maintenance issues, asserting his authority as landlord even in this most intimate of contexts. The scene is clearly meant to be darkly comedic, showing Sanders as someone whose sense of responsibility and control extends to every aspect of his life. But what it actually reveals is a deeply disturbed individual with no sense of appropriate boundaries, no respect for others as autonomous human beings, and an obsessive need for dominance in all situations. Then again, the flat, forgettable pairing of words chosen to replace The Dark Knight speaks to Boll's originality and imagination as a filmmaker. Citizen Vigilante is the kind of title a computer algorithm might generate after being fed a list of relevant keywords. It is completely generic, indistinguishable from a dozen other direct-to-VOD action thrillers released each year. It tells the viewer nothing about the film except its broadest genre category. The original title, The Dark Knight, was obviously an attempt to capitalize on the cultural cachet of Christopher Nolan's Batman films, but at least it had some thematic resonance. It suggested a self-styled hero operating in moral shadow, a figure of disputed righteousness. Citizen Vigilante suggests nothing except Boll's complete lack of creative vision. Technical incompetence across all departments. Beyond the failures of writing, directing, and performance, Citizen Vigilante is technically incompetent in virtually every department. The cinematography is flat and television-like, with no sense of visual style or coherent color palette. Scenes are simply captured with adequate lighting and exposure, without any thought given to composition, camera movement, or how images might convey meaning beyond their literal content. The editing is perhaps even worse, with action sequences cut so choppily that it becomes impossible to follow the spatial relationships between characters or understand the flow of violence. This is a common problem in low-budget action cinema, where limited coverage and poorly choreographed stunts are disguised through rapid cutting. But even by those diminished standards, Citizen Vigilante is particularly incomprehensible. The sound design is equally poor, with dialogue often poorly mixed against background noise, gunshots that lack proper weight and impact, and a score that telegraphs emotions with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. The music swells during moments that are apparently supposed to be triumphant as Sanders executes his targets, further emphasizing the film's moral bankruptcy. The production design suggests the film was shot guerrilla style in whatever locations Boll could secure for minimal cost, with no effort made to dress sets or create a coherent visual world. Different scenes appear to take place in completely different cities based on the changing architecture and ambient atmosphere, further contributing to the geographical confusion that plagues the entire project. The exploitation of real trauma, concluding with a dedication to rape victims in Europe who were betrayed by our legal system, Citizen Vigilante is a film that disguises its exploitation roots behind the pretense of exploring an important topic, even as it proceeds to treat that subject completely inappropriately. This dedication is perhaps the most offensive element of the entire production, a transparent attempt to claim moral high ground while having spent the previous runtime wallowing in exactly the kind of exploitation that victimizes vulnerable people. Sexual violence is indeed a serious issue that deserves thoughtful examination in cinema and other art forms. Films like The Accused, Promising Young Woman, and I May Destroy You have approached the subject with the gravity and care it demands, centering the experiences of survivors and interrogating the systems that fail them. Citizen Vigilante does none of this. It uses sexual violence as a plot device to justify Sanders' actions, treating victims as props in his revenge fantasy rather than as fully realized human beings with their own agency and perspectives. The film is not about survivors healing or finding justice. It's about a violent man using their trauma as an excuse for his own brutal impulses. The dedication feels particularly cynical given that the film itself demonstrates no understanding of or empathy for survivors of sexual violence. They exist in the narrative solely to be victimized and then to validate Sanders' vigilantism. Their voices are not heard except to agree that the legal system has failed them and that extrajudicial murder is the only answer. Between Boll and Hammer, it's hard to know who gets the worst deal in hitching his wagon to the other's star. Boll has directed many terrible films, but Citizen Vigilante may be his nadir. A project so misconceived and poorly executed that it makes Blood Rain look competent by comparison. For Hammer, a talented actor whose career has been derailed by serious allegations, choosing this as a comeback vehicle suggests either profound poor judgment or complete desperation. But any of those victims to whom it purports to pay tribute would be better served looking elsewhere for a champion than to mistake this shameless exercise in ambulance chasing for an earnest pursuit of justice. The film offers nothing to survivors except the exploitation of their trauma for cheap entertainment. It contributes nothing to conversations about justice reform, victim support, or addressing sexual violence. It is simply a bad film made by a bad filmmaker, starring an actor whose off-screen behavior makes him perhaps the least appropriate person imaginable to portray someone claiming to protect the vulnerable. Citizen Vigilante fails on every conceivable level. As entertainment, it is boring and incomprehensible. As action cinema, it is poorly choreographed and incoherently edited. As social commentary, it is repugnant and ignorant. As a star vehicle for Armie Hammer, it is career suicide. As a Uwe Boll film, it represents no growth or evolution from his earlier disasters. The film will likely find a small audience of viewers drawn by morbid curiosity about Hammer's return to screen or Boll's continued ability to produce films despite universal critical rejection. But even those viewers will find little to enjoy in this tedious, morally bankrupt exercise in exploitation masquerading as justice. For anyone interested in vigilante films that actually engage with the moral complexity of their subject matter, countless better options exist. For anyone interested in films about justice for sexual violence survivors, this is perhaps the worst possible option. For anyone interested in competent filmmaking of any kind, Citizen Vigilante has nothing to offer. The only positive thing one can say about the film is that it serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of self-righteous violence, though certainly not in the way Boll intended. Sanders is presented as a hero, but comes across as a dangerous zealot. The film endorses his actions, but repels viewers with their brutality and the flimsiness of their moral justification. In failing so completely to make its case for vigilantism, Citizen Vigilante accidentally becomes an argument against it, though one wishes a more talented filmmaker had made that argument intentionally, with skill and intelligence rather than through incompetence. In an age where cinema is increasingly accessible and international collaboration easier than ever, it remains a mystery how Uwe Boll continues to secure financing and attract talent to his projects. Citizen Vigilante will not solve that mystery, but it will stand as further evidence that some filmmakers, no matter how many opportunities they receive, will never learn their craft or develop the self-awareness to recognize their limitations. Avoid Citizen Vigilante at all costs. It is a waste of your time, an insult to your intelligence, and an exploitation of real trauma for the basest entertainment purposes. The only justice it deserves is to be forgotten as quickly as possible.
Citizen Vigilante, the landlord as executioner, a revealing opening premise. 28 minutes into Citizen Vigilante, our avenging angel pauses mid-coitus in a brothel to scold the prostitute about the mold creeping up her wall. He is, you understand, a landlord first. The buildings came to him from a dead father, and he manages them with the same exactitude he brings to executing rapists and crooked judges. The moment is meant as nothing in particular, and it gives the whole game away. The man who has appointed himself the sword of justice cannot get through a paid encounter without stopping for a property inspection. This scene crystallizes everything wrong with Citizen Vigilante in a single excruciating vignette. Here is Michael Sanders, the film's protagonist, engaging in the most intimate of human transactions, sex for money, yet unable to switch off the controlling, entitled mindset of a property owner. The woman before him is reduced to a tenant first, a sexual partner second, and a human being not at all. The mold on the wall concerns him more than the person lying beneath it. It is a moment of such spectacular tonal deftness that one almost admires its purity. The scene reveals the film's central hollowness. Sanders has no authentic moral center, no driving passion for justice, no traumatic wound that might explain or justify his violence. He is simply a man of means who has decided that his property portfolio and his personal sense of order matter more than human life. The buildings came to him through inheritance, unearned, like his sense of righteousness, and he manages them with the obsessive attention to detail that characterizes men who mistake control for competence. That this moment passes without commentary, without irony, without any acknowledgement of what it reveals about our supposed hero, speaks volumes about director Uwe Boll's fundamental misunderstanding of the genre he's attempting to work within. A more self-aware filmmaker might have used this beat to critique Sanders, to show the audience the entitled monster beneath the vigilante's mask. Boll presents it as character detail, perhaps even meant to be endearing. Look how responsible our hero is, attending to his duties even during recreation. Michael Sanders, an avenger without a wound. That man is Michael Sanders, an avenger with unexamined daddy issues, played by Armie Hammer, whose chilly control the film keeps mistaking for character. He is the work of director Uwe Boll, who operates in two registers. Some of his exploitation pictures have no point whatsoever. The Rampage trilogy stands as a monument to the form, and the rest rent out whatever resentment is loudest that season. Boll's career has been defined by his ability to tap into cultural anger without understanding its sources or implications. His Rampage films featured a disaffected young man committing mass murder, presented with neither condemnation nor genuine psychological exploration, simply violence as spectacle, dressed up with shallow anti-capitalist or anti-technology rhetoric that Boll clearly didn't believe or understand. They were exercises in pure nihilism, and at least they were honest about it. 15 years ago that meant a working stiff swindled by the banks, gunning down bankers. Assault on Wall Street, 2013, arrived after the financial crisis, when public anger at the banking sector reached fever pitch. Boll's film attempted to channel that rage into a revenge fantasy where an ordinary man, ruined by financial malfeasance, takes up arms against those who destroyed his life. The film was crude, heavy-handed, and politically incoherent, but it at least had the shape of the genre, a man pushed too far by systemic injustice, turning to violence as a last resort. In 2026 it reaches for the most combustible material on the shelf, a glassy, tailored American loose in a Europe that the film imagines as overrun, where migrants knife and rape almost as a matter of routine. That is the version the picture sells. The one it makes is stranger and emptier, because its hero has no wound, no soul, and no politics worth the name. This is where Citizen Vigilante departs from even the debased standards of Boll's previous work. Sanders has not been personally victimized. His family has not been harmed. He has not suffered financial ruin or professional humiliation. He is a wealthy American property owner who has decided, apparently on purely ideological grounds, that Europe's migrants deserve extrajudicial execution. There is no inciting incident that might generate audience sympathy, no personal stake that might make his crusade comprehensible as the actions of a damaged individual rather than a sociopath. The daddy issues the film gestures toward, the inherited properties, the occasional mention of a deceased father, are never explored with enough depth to constitute actual characterization. We learn nothing about Sanders' relationship with his father, nothing about what values or traumas were passed down, nothing that might illuminate why this particular man chose this particular path. The film simply assumes that having a dead father and inherited wealth is characterization enough, when in fact it only raises more questions about privilege, entitlement, and the kind of person who mistakes property ownership for moral authority. The anatomy of exploitation cinema and where Boll fails. The genre Boll is ransacking knows what he never learns: revenge needs a personal wound. This is not a matter of taste or artistic preference, it is structural necessity. The revenge narrative, from ancient Greek tragedy through Shakespeare to contemporary cinema, requires an inciting incident that transforms the protagonist from ordinary person to instrument of vengeance. Without that transformation, without that wound, there is no story, only a psychopath killing people. Michael Winner's Death Wish, 1974, unsettled Pauline Kael precisely because it flattered the audience's bloodlust, yet the thing had a spine. Paul Kersey loses his wife and watches his daughter destroyed. The floor gives way beneath an ordinary life before he ever loads a gun. Kael's famous critique of Death Wish focused on how the film manipulated audience emotions, creating a scenario so horrific that viewers would cheer for Kersey's subsequent violence without questioning the moral implications. She was right to be disturbed by the film's effectiveness at generating that response. But even as Kael condemned Death Wish for being a deeply immoral movie, she acknowledged that it worked as a narrative. Kersey is established as a peaceful, liberal architect who opposes gun violence. The attack on his family is genuinely traumatic, presented with enough horror that we understand it as a transformative event. The film then tracks his descent into vigilantism as a kind of madness, a breaking of something fundamental in his psyche. We don't have to approve of his actions to understand them as the result of unbearable grief and rage. Even the cheapest avenger usually begins in grief, humiliation, or ruin. Sanders gets no such fall. No personal catastrophe sets him loose, and the killing comes first while the reasons straggle in behind it. This inverted structure, violence first, justification later, is fatal to the film's coherence. We meet Sanders as he already is, armed, dangerous, and committed to his mission. The film then attempts to explain his actions through exposition about migrant crime and judicial failure, but these feel like post hoc rationalizations rather than genuine motivations. Consider the structure of virtually any successful revenge film. Kill Bill opens with the bride's near death at her own wedding, then tracks her systematic revenge against those responsible. John Wick begins with the murder of the puppy that represented his dead wife's final gift, a grief piled on grief that breaks something in him. The Crow opens with the protagonist's death alongside his fiancée, and his return from the grave to set things right. Oldboy, the Korean original, begins with inexplicable imprisonment and works backward to uncover the wound that motivated it. Even exploitation films with minimal artistic pretension understand this structure. I Spit on Your Grave, 1978, is a brutal, controversial film that many critics consider irredeemable, but it at least follows the template: extended assault, followed by calculated revenge. The audience may be horrified, may question the film's existence, but they cannot question why the protagonist does what she does.
Exploitation can earn it. Pam Grier's Nurse in Coffee, 1973, has someone to mourn and a fury you believe down to your shoes. The film is grindhouse to the marrow, and it commits. Jack Hill's blaxploitation classic is unsubtle about what it is, a revenge fantasy wrapped in social commentary about drugs destroying black communities, but Grier's performance sells every frame. When her younger sister ends up comatose from bad drugs, Coffee's rage is immediate, personal, and utterly convincing. The film never pretends to be more than it is. It's exploitation, built on sex and violence, but it commits fully to its premise. Coffee doesn't question whether she has the right to kill the dealers and suppliers who destroyed her sister, she simply does it, and Grier plays her with such conviction that the audience goes along for the ride. The mode is no disgrace. It only has to mean it's violence, and Citizen Vigilante cannot, because it never settles on what the mayhem is for. This is the fundamental failure of Boll's film. It wants to be taken seriously as social commentary, dedicating itself to victims of crime and positioning Sanders as a righteous crusader. But it also wants to be exploitation, delivering brutal violence and transgressive content. A skilled filmmaker might thread this needle, creating something that works as both visceral entertainment and genuine critique. Boll manages neither, producing a film too morally simplistic to be thought-provoking and too incoherent to be entertainingly trashy. A narrative without logic or consistency. It opens on an immigrant stabbing a young mother in the neck before her small son, a provocation that promises a revenge tracked in block capitals. Then it loses the thread. This opening scene is clearly designed to generate maximum outrage. A defenseless woman, a child witness, a brutal murder, and the killer's immigrant status emphasized for maximum inflammatory effect. It's a scene calculated to make the audience hungry for vengeance, to position Sanders' subsequent violence as justified payback. But the film immediately abandons this narrative thread. The murdered woman is never mentioned again. The orphaned child does not factor into Sanders' motivation or actions. The specific killer is not pursued or punished within the film's runtime. The scene exists purely as provocation, a way to prime the audience for violence without actually building a coherent story around it. It's the cinematic equivalent of rage bait on social media, designed to generate an emotional reaction without any substance behind it. The wrath sprays outward. Teenagers caught skipping a bus fare, a squad of policemen mowed down to the lilt of a samba, the badges belonging to no one's idea of the enemy but his own. As the film progresses, Sanders' targets become increasingly random and his violence increasingly disproportionate. Teenagers fare dodging on public transit are beaten and humiliated. Police officers, supposedly representatives of the very law and order Sanders claims to be defending, are massacred en masse in a scene that plays their deaths for entertainment. The samba music accompanying the police slaughter is particularly revealing. It's meant to be edgy, transgressive, the kind of needle drop that Tarantino made famous in films like Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction. But Tarantino's use of upbeat music during violence serves a purpose. It creates cognitive dissonance that forces the viewer to confront the gap between the entertainment value of screen violence and its actual horror. Boll simply thinks it's cool. There's no thematic reason for the music, no commentary being made, no artistic purpose being served. Its violence is spectacle, dressed up with an incongruent soundtrack because that's what edgy films do. The emptiness of the choice reflects the emptiness of the entire project. At one point, Sanders plays chicken with a motorist whose only sin is staying in his lane. Human beings are such sheep, he muses. They will obey the law even when their lives are in danger, and he runs the man into a ditch to burn. This scene encapsulates the film's incoherence. Sanders positions himself as a defender of civilization against chaos, yet here he murders a random stranger specifically because that person was following traffic laws. The keeper of the law murders a stranger for obeying it. The contradiction is not presented as irony or as evidence of Sanders' madness. It's simply there, unexamined, as if Boll cannot see the problem. A film genuinely interested in exploring the vigilante's psychology might use this moment to show Sanders' moral degradation, his transformation from avenging angel to simple serial killer. But Citizen Vigilante presents it as just another scene, neither more nor less justified than any other act of violence in the film. When he finally reaches real criminals, a migrant gang that raped a young woman and walked free, he gets there across more bodies than the rapists ever left, punishing one of the teenage attackers by killing his parents and sister. Even when Sanders targets actual criminals who have committed heinous acts and escaped justice, the scenario that should generate maximum audience sympathy, he does so in a way that undermines any moral high ground. Killing the attacker's entire family is not justice or even revenge, it's collective punishment, the kind of tactic associated with authoritarian regimes and war crimes. The parents and sister had no involvement in the rape. They are killed simply for being related to someone who committed a crime. This is the logic of blood feuds and tribal warfare, not civilized justice. The self-styled steward of order is its busiest source of disorder. By any objective measure, Sanders causes more death and destruction than the criminals he targets. He is not restoring order to a chaotic system, he is adding chaos, undermining legitimate law enforcement, and terrorizing innocent people. If the film had the intelligence to recognize this, it might be a critique of vigilantism. Instead, it simply presents this reality without comment, as if Boll cannot see the contradiction between what Sanders claims to be and what he actually is. The borrowed language of fascism and online radicalization. What case survives arrives secondhand. Boll pipes it in through clumsy newscasts on an invented network and montages of Instagram patriots, reading their lines like cue cards. "This guy is taking out the trash, we need somebody like him back home." The film attempts to contextualize Sanders' violence through social media and news coverage, showing online influencers praising his actions and ordinary citizens expressing support for his methods. This could have been the foundation for an interesting exploration of how vigilante violence gets amplified and justified through digital platforms. In our contemporary moment, we've seen how algorithms and echo chambers can radicalize individuals, how online communities can celebrate violence, how social media turns complex moral questions into tribal signaling. A smart film might explore how someone like Sanders is created by and creates the media environment around him. But Boll's treatment of this material is perfunctory and unconvincing. The influencers delivering testimonials are clearly actors reading from a script, bringing no authenticity or conviction to their performances. The news coverage feels fake in the wrong way, not satirical or heightened, just poorly produced. And the film never interrogates whether this support actually justifies Sanders' actions, or whether it simply demonstrates how easily people can be manipulated into celebrating violence. Paul Verhoeven built RoboCop out of precisely this device, and his mock broadcasts drew blood. Boll's merely sit there, narrating the mood he would like you to catch. Verhoeven understood that satire requires exaggeration and clarity. His fake commercials and news segments in RoboCop were deliberately over the top, pushing the consumerism and authoritarianism of his dystopian Detroit to absurd extremes that revealed the seeds of those same tendencies in 1980s America. The commercials for Nuke and designer drug, for the Family Heart Center which keeps your heart beating after you're brain dead, for the 6000 SUX, an American tradition, were all viciously funny because they took real advertising language and pushed it just past the edge of plausibility. The news coverage, with its chirpy anchors treating murders and disasters as entertainment, felt like a dark mirror of actual local news. Boll's media satire, if we can even call it that, has none of this sharpness or purpose. The fake news and social media content in Citizen Vigilante doesn't exaggerate or illuminate anything about real media. It simply states the thesis Boll wants the audience to accept, that Sanders is popular, that people support his actions, that his violence represents the will of the people. It's not satire, it's propaganda that doesn't even bother to be clever. Sanders himself prefers the camera to the kill. Face pixelated, he uploads monologues to YouTube, everything that I do for you, and free associates about Nietzsche with the confidence of a man who met the idea on a podcast. This is the film's most potentially interesting element. Sanders is a performative vigilante, someone is interested in crafting his public image as in actually punishing criminals. This could have been a sharp commentary on how contemporary violence is inseparable from its documentation and dissemination, how atrocities are committed with one eye on the camera, how social media has transformed every act into potential content. We've seen this in real-world terrorism, in mass shootings live-streamed to Facebook, in manifestos posted online before attacks. A film that seriously engaged with Sanders as a media-savvy killer could have been genuinely disturbing and relevant. Instead, Boll treats Sanders' video monologues as straightforward expressions of his philosophy, opportunities for him to explain his worldview directly to the audience. The Nietzsche references are particularly painful, suggesting a character with intellectual pretensions but no actual depth. Sanders name drops the concept of the Übermensch without demonstrating any real understanding of Nietzsche's philosophy, which is complex, often contradictory, and certainly not a simple endorsement of vigilante violence. The confidence of a man who met the idea on a podcast is the perfect description. Sanders has the surface-level familiarity with Nietzsche that comes from listening to other people summarize his ideas, from reading Wikipedia entries and quotes out of context. He wields these references as intellectual decoration, a way to make his violence seem philosophical rather than pathological. And Boll, who appears to have the same shallow understanding, presents this as genuine wisdom rather than pretentious nonsense. The one moment that nearly works. The cleverest beat in a witless script comes when he works a hospitalized rape victim, borrowing the vocabulary of victim's advocacy to coax her into blessing his revenge before he steps out to take it. You half wonder whether the whole thing is meant as parody, and a sharper film might have been. This one is too incurious to know what it holds.
This scene is genuinely unsettling in a way the rest of the film never manages. Sanders visits a rape victim in the hospital, and rather than simply offering to kill her attackers, he manipulates her using therapeutic language. He speaks about empowerment, about taking back control, about the inadequacy of the legal system to provide closure or justice. He positions his offer of revenge not as his own need for violence but as part of her healing process. It's predatory and deeply disturbing, a scene that reveals Sanders as a manipulator who exploits trauma to justify his actions. He needs her blessing, her permission, because it allows him to frame his violence as altruistic rather than self-serving. And he's skilled enough at this manipulation to get what he wants, to leave her believing that his planned murders are somehow for her benefit rather than his satisfaction. If the film recognized this scene as revealing Sanders' monstrousness, it would be its strongest moment. If Boll understood that he had written a scene showing his protagonist cynically exploiting a trauma victim to justify murder, the entire film might have worked as a critique of vigilantism and the entitled men who practice it. But there's no indication that Boll sees anything wrong with Sanders' behavior here. The scene plays as strategy, as Sanders intelligently building support for his mission, rather than as moral horror. The waste that stings is Hammer. Whatever one makes of his fall from favor, he can still hold a frame, and in that hospital scene he nearly makes the rot persuasive. He needed a comeback. Citizen Vigilante extends his exile instead. Armie Hammer has become a pariah in Hollywood following allegations of sexual abuse and the revelation of disturbing private messages expressing violent sexual fantasies. These allegations are serious and credible, and they have rightfully ended his career as a leading man in mainstream American cinema. But it's also true that Hammer, at his peak, was a skilled actor with genuine screen presence. His performance as the Winklevoss twins in The Social Network demonstrated range and comic timing. His work in Call Me by Your Name was sensitive and nuanced. Even in commercial fare like The Man from U.N.C.L.E. and The Lone Ranger, he showed old-fashioned movie star charisma. All of that ability is still visible in Citizen Vigilante, particularly in the hospital scene. Hammer plays the manipulation perfectly, his voice smooth and reassuring, his body language non-threatening, his eyes conveying just enough warmth to seem genuine while hiding the calculation beneath. He makes Sanders' predatory behavior almost convincing, nearly selling the idea that this violence could be altruistic. It's a reminder that Hammer can act, that he can inhabit a character and find the human reality in even poor material. Which makes his decision to appear in this film even more baffling. If this was meant as a comeback, it has failed spectacularly. The film is too poor to rehabilitate anyone's reputation, too offensive to generate sympathetic coverage, too obscure to remind audiences of Hammer's talent. His performance, while occasionally effective, is in service of a character so repugnant and a film so morally bankrupt that it can only reinforce the worst perceptions of who Hammer is as a person. A genuine comeback would have required humility, a supporting role in a quality project, working for a respected filmmaker, playing a character who could demonstrate range without courting controversy. Instead, Hammer chose to lead a Uwe Boll film playing a violent vigilante who targets migrants and manipulates rape victims. It's difficult to imagine a worse choice for someone trying to rebuild their career in public. Image. The politics of incoherence. Its reactionary provocations will get it filed as a conservative film. It isn't one. At first glance, Citizen Vigilante appears to be a straightforward right-wing fantasy, a strong man taking action against immigrants, criminals, and the woke systems that supposedly protect them. The film's rhetoric about migrants overrunning Europe, about courts failing victims, about the need for ordinary citizens to take justice into their own hands, all of this sounds like it was lifted from conservative media and online forums. And certainly, the film will find an audience among those who share these politics, who will see Sanders as a hero standing up against political correctness and demographic change. But to call Citizen Vigilante a conservative film is to grant it more ideological coherence than it possesses. Cornering an Interpol officer, Sanders lays out the thesis, an unfriendly takeover by the Islamist extremists and the blindsided woke left, and only one remedy for it: you end this, or we the people will end it ourselves. This is the film's most explicit political statement, delivered as a grand pronouncement of Sanders' worldview. But examine it closely and it makes little sense. The Islamist extremists and the blindsided woke left are not natural allies. In fact, they are often opposed on fundamental questions about women's rights, LGBTQ+ issues, secularism, and free speech. Lumping them together as a unified threat is incoherent, revealing that Sanders and Boll are simply listing enemies without any real understanding of how these political forces relate to each other. The phrase, "we the people," is particularly telling. It invokes American constitutional language in a European setting, reflecting Sanders and Boll's inability to engage with the actual political and legal context of wherever this film is supposedly taking place. It's a phrase designed to sound populist and democratic, but it's being used to justify extrajudicial killing by a wealthy property owner, hardly the voice of the people. That is a Jacobin fantasy wearing right-wing talking points as drag. This is the key insight into what Citizen Vigilante actually is, not a conservative film but a revolutionary one, calling for the violent overthrow of existing legal and political systems. The Jacobins of the French Revolution, whatever their initial ideals, became architects of the terror, sending thousands to the guillotine in the name of purifying society. Sanders' vision is similarly apocalyptic and purifying. He doesn't want to reform the courts or change immigration policy through democratic means. He wants to tear down the entire system and replace it with his personal judgment, executed at gunpoint. This is not conservative in any meaningful sense. Conservatism, at its root, seeks to preserve existing institutions and traditions, to change slowly and carefully. Sanders wants to burn it all down. The fact that he wraps this revolutionary violence in right-wing rhetoric about migrants and traditional values doesn't make it conservative, it makes it fascist. Fascism has historically combined revolutionary political violence with appeals to traditional identity and the promise of restoring a mythical past. It positions a strong leader or movement as the true voice of the people against corrupt elites, while simultaneously embracing extreme hierarchy and violence against scapegoated out groups. The scandals the film invokes are real, of course. Europe has mismanaged immigration, courts do fail the innocent. This is where Citizen Vigilante becomes genuinely dangerous rather than merely offensive. Europe has indeed struggled with how to manage large-scale immigration from the Middle East and Africa, with different countries taking vastly different approaches and experiencing varying levels of success and difficulty. There have been genuine failures of integration, instances of immigrant crime, and court cases where victims have felt betrayed by lenient sentences or procedural protections for defendants. These are real issues that deserve serious policy discussion and democratic deliberation. By acknowledging this, the film gives itself a veneer of legitimacy, suggesting that it's engaging with genuine problems rather than simply indulging in bigotry. But Sanders believes little is worth conserving beyond his rental units, and Boll is happy to give him the body count. This is what gives the lie to any claim that the film is seriously engaging with these issues. Sanders has no vision for what he wants to build or preserve. He has no political philosophy beyond violence, no plan for actually addressing immigration or crime beyond killing people he personally deems guilty. His only concrete attachment is to his property, to the buildings that generate his wealth and give him power over others. He is not fighting to preserve European culture, our Christian values, our democratic institutions, all things actual conservatives might claim to be defending. He's simply a wealthy man who has decided that his money and his violence give him the right to kill with impunity. And Boll, rather than recognizing or critiquing this emptiness, simply enables it. The body count rises, the violence becomes more excessive, and the film treats it all as justified because Europe has problems. Because migrants commit crimes, because courts sometimes fail. The logical gap between systemic issues exist, and, therefore mass murder is justified, is never bridged, because Boll is not interested in logic or genuine political engagement. Censorship, marketing, and manufactured controversy. Citizen Vigilante was refused a certificate by Germany's ratings board, effectively keeping it from wide release, and Boll has worn the verdict like a laurel. In Germany, the Freiwillige Selbstkontrolle der Filmwirtschaft (FSK) is responsible for rating films for age-appropriate audiences. In extreme cases, the board can refuse to grant any rating, which means the film cannot be advertised or sold to the general public, effectively banning it from mainstream distribution. The board's refusal to rate Citizen Vigilante is unusual and indicates serious concerns about the film's content. Boll has responded to this decision by positioning himself as a martyr to free speech, an artist censored by politically correct bureaucrats who can't handle challenging material. He has promoted the ratings refusal as evidence that the film is dangerous, transgressive, and necessary, precisely the kind of art that makes comfortable people uncomfortable. This is, of course, nonsense. The board detected more menace in the picture than its maker could supply. Germany's Film Ratings Board has seen countless violent films, from exploitation horror to serious war dramas. They rate films that contain graphic violence, sexual content, and controversial political themes on a regular basis. What concerned them about Citizen Vigilante was not simply that it's violent, but that it celebrates and promotes vigilante violence against immigrants without any critical distance or moral framework.
The board likely recognized that the film could serve as propaganda for far-right extremism, that it presents violence against minorities as justified and heroic, and that it lacks any artistic merit that might balance these dangers. This is not censorship of challenging art. It's a responsible decision to prevent the distribution of material that could inspire real-world violence. Boll's response, treating the refusal as a badge of honor rather than a professional embarrassment, reveals his fundamental unseriousness as an artist. He signs off with a dedication to Europe's victims, betrayed by the courts, certain he has delivered something righteous. The film ends with an on-screen dedication to victims of sexual violence who have been failed by the European legal system. This dedication, like so much else in the film, is cynical and manipulative. Boll positions his film as advocacy for victims, as speaking for those who have been silenced or ignored by official systems. But the film does not center victims' voices or experiences. It does not explore the actual failures of legal systems to address sexual violence, the backlog of untested rape kits, the low conviction rates, the ways victims are re-traumatized by court proceedings, the inadequacy of support services. Instead, it uses victims as props to justify Sanders' violence. They appear briefly, are manipulated into endorsing revenge, and then disappear while Sanders goes on his killing spree. The dedication suggests Boll genuinely believes he has made a film that honors and helps victims, when he has actually created a film that exploits their trauma for cheap entertainment. The substance beneath the provocation. What he has made is a purge without the nerve of its own premise. For all its provocations, Citizen Vigilante is ultimately a cowardly film. It wants to traffic in controversial politics and extreme violence, but it lacks the courage to fully commit to any position or to face the implications of what it's showing. A genuinely transgressive film would follow its premise to its logical conclusion, would show us what Sanders' vision of justice would actually create. It would depict the escalating cycle of violence, the breakdown of social order, the innocent people caught in the crossfire. It would force both Sanders and the audience to confront the cost of this approach, to see what vigilante justice looks like when scaled up from individual revenge to social movement. Or, alternatively, it could fully commit to being fascist propaganda, making a coherent argument for why democratic systems should be replaced with violent strongman rule. This would be morally repugnant, but it would at least be honest about what it is. The film could be engaged with and argued against on clear ideological grounds. Instead, Citizen Vigilante tries to have it both ways. It wants the thrill of showing violence against migrants and criminals, but it also wants to maintain plausible deniability about its politics. It wants to present Sanders as a hero, but without engaging with what heroism in this context would actually mean. It wants to be taken seriously as social commentary, but without doing the intellectual work that genuine commentary requires. For a movie about cleaning up the streets, Citizen Vigilante never works out which streets, whose law, or why. The geographical vagueness, the incoherent targets, the shifting justifications, all of this speaks to a fundamental emptiness at the film's core. If Boll had chosen a specific city, Berlin, Paris, Stockholm, he would have to engage with actual immigration policies, actual crime statistics, actual political debates. The specifics would force some degree of honesty. By keeping everything vague, Europe as a monolithic setting, migrants as an indifferentiated threat, courts and police as generically corrupt, Boll can indulge in fantasy without being challenged by reality. He can present a Europe that exists only in far-right fever dreams, where migrants roam freely committing violence while authorities do nothing, where only a brave vigilante stands between civilization and chaos. This Europe doesn't exist. Real Europe is complicated. Some countries have managed immigration better than others. Some cities have more crime than others. Court systems vary widely in their effectiveness and their treatment of both victims and defendants. By refusing to engage with this complexity, Boll reveals that he's not actually interested in the real issues his film pretends to address. Sanders is simply a landlord with a gun, appointed inspector of a civilization, and the mold keeps climbing the wall. This is the perfect final image for the film. Sanders, for all his grandiose rhetoric about justice and civilization, is fundamentally just a property owner who doesn't like seeing his assets decline in value. The mold on the wall, decay, entropy, the physical manifestation of things falling apart, is what really bothers him. Not human suffering, not injustice, not even crime in any meaningful sense, just the decline of property values, the sense that things are not being maintained to his standards, that the civilization he inherited, like his buildings, is not being kept in proper order. And his response is not to actually address the sources of decay, to improve living conditions, to invest in communities, to support democratic reform, but simply to kill the people he blames for the decline. The mold keeps climbing because killing people doesn't stop decay. Vigilante violence doesn't address systemic problems. Sanders can execute as many migrants, criminals, and woke leftists as he wants, but the mold will keep climbing because he's not actually fixing anything. He's just indulging his own violent impulses and mistaking property management for moral authority. That Boll ends on this image without recognizing its implications is fitting. The mold climbing the wall is the film itself. Rot disguised as righteousness, decay pretending to be renewal, the spread of toxic ideology while the builder watches and does nothing except create more violence. Citizen Vigilante fails on every level a film can fail. As entertainment, it is dull and incoherent, with poorly staged action and a narrative that never coheres into anything resembling a story. As exploitation, it lacks the commitment and style of genuine grindhouse cinema, too self-serious to be fun and too incompetent to be effectively transgressive. As social commentary, it is worse than useless, actively harmful in its promotion of violence against vulnerable populations and its cynical exploitation of real victims' trauma. As a political statement, it is incoherent, unable to articulate any vision beyond vague anger and the appeal of violence. For Armie Hammer, it represents a catastrophic miscalculation in his attempted return to acting. Whatever one's opinion of the allegations against him, this film will not help him rebuild his career or his reputation. He deserved better material for a comeback, and victims of sexual violence deserve better than to have their trauma exploited for a Uwe Boll vigilante film. For Uwe Boll, Citizen Vigilante is sadly typical. Another failure to add to a career defined by them. Another demonstration that he has learned nothing from decades of universal critical rejection. He remains a filmmaker without insight, skill, or basic human empathy, churning out provocations that mistake offensiveness for bravery and violence for meaning. The film should be avoided by anyone seeking quality cinema, thoughtful engagement with difficult topics, or even competent action entertainment. It has nothing to offer except confirmation that some filmmakers should have their cameras taken away, and that vigilante fantasies in the hands of incompetent ideologues produce only rot. The mold keeps climbing the wall, and Uwe Boll keeps making films. Both phenomena speak to systems that have failed to address underlying problems. And both will continue until someone with actual authority decides that enough is enough. A hard-hitting vigilante thriller starring Armie Hammer that is guaranteed to divide audiences, politicians and critics alike. And that is precisely the point. The film that dares to go there. There are films that entertain. There are films that provoke. And then, very occasionally, there are films that do both at the same time while refusing to apologize for a single frame. Uwe Boll's Citizen Vigilante falls firmly into that third and rarest category. Arriving at a moment when public trust in institutions is at historic lows across the Western world, and when the question of who truly delivers justice is being asked with increasing urgency in living rooms, courtrooms and political chambers alike, Citizen Vigilante feels less like a movie and more like a pressure valve finally releasing. This is a vigilante action thriller built for the current moment. It is a film that holds a mirror up to society and asks a deeply uncomfortable question. When the systems designed to protect ordinary people repeatedly fail them, what options does the individual have left? Boll, long dismissed by mainstream critics as a reliable producer of cinematic noise, here delivers something considerably more serious and considerably more interesting than his reputation might suggest. Citizen Vigilante is provocative by design, controversial by intent, and genuinely effective as a piece of genre filmmaking. It is, without question, one of the most timely and noteworthy releases of 2026.
A nonlinear story built for maximum impact. Citizen Vigilante follows Sanders Armie Hammer, a former U.S. Army officer who has quietly rebuilt his life in Europe following his military service. To the outside world, Sanders is living low, keeping a respectable distance from the turbulence of his past.
But beneath this carefully constructed civilian exterior, Sanders has been operating in the shadows as the Vigilante Citizen, a feared figure who has been methodically targeting individuals he believes have escaped the reach of conventional justice. The film is structured around a nonlinear narrative that moves between different periods of Sanders' activities, gradually assembling a full picture of who he is, what drives him and where his mission is ultimately heading. This storytelling approach is one of the film's smartest choices. Rather than presenting Sanders' vigilantism as a straightforward heroic arc, the fragmented structure forces viewers to engage actively with the material, piecing together not only the facts of the story but also their own moral response to what Sanders is doing. By the time the narrative pieces align, the audience has had time to form a genuine relationship with the character, to understand his perspective even while remaining free to question it. The story picks up momentum as crime escalates and public confidence in law enforcement and government institutions continues to decline. Sanders responds to this environment not with passivity but with action, confronting those he has identified as having evaded justice, criminals, abusers and others who he believes the formal system has failed to hold accountable. As his activities become more visible, they attract the attention of authorities on both sides of the Atlantic, setting the stage for a collision between a man acting on private conviction and the institutional forces legally obligated to stop him. What makes the plot work as well as it does is the fact that it never loses sight of the human stakes beneath the action. This is not simply a film about a man who hurts bad people and looks cool doing it. It is a film that asks what happens to a society when enough people feel that the rules no longer protect them. That question gives the narrative genuine weight, and it is to Boll's credit that the screenplay never lets the action overwhelm it. Armie Hammer as Sanders, a performance built on conviction. It would be impossible to discuss Citizen Vigilante without spending considerable time on Armie Hammer's performance, because it is the centerpiece around which everything else is constructed. Hammer plays Sanders with a quiet, controlled intensity that is exactly right for the material. This is not a character who grandstands or monologues. Sanders is a man who has made a decision, a deeply serious and deeply personal decision, and he carries that decision with him in every scene he appears in. Hammer's physicality serves the role well. He is convincing as a former military man, composed under pressure, precise in movement, capable of violence without theatrics. But it is in the quieter moments that the performance truly distinguishes itself. When Sanders visits victims who feel abandoned by the justice system, Hammer communicates the weight of those encounters with restraint rather than sentimentality. The character genuinely listens. He genuinely cares. And that care, paradoxically, is precisely what drives him toward actions that put him outside the law. The film asks a great deal of Hammer. Sanders needs to be simultaneously sympathetic and morally ambiguous, relatable in his frustrations and yet clearly operating in territory that most viewers would never enter themselves. Hammer navigates those competing demands. With skill, he makes the character's logic understandable without ever quite removing the discomfort of watching it play out. That balance is difficult to achieve, and the fact that Hammer achieves it consistently across the film is a genuine accomplishment. For viewers who have followed Hammer's career, this performance also represents something of a personal statement. Boll reportedly pursued Hammer specifically for this role, and it is easy to see why the actor responded to the material. Sanders is a man who has been tested by public scrutiny and institutional pressure, who has emerged from that testing with his sense of purpose intact. Whether that reading adds a layer of meaning to the performance or not, what appears on screen is a committed, effective and at times genuinely affecting portrayal of a man who believes absolutely in what he is doing. Costas Mandylor in the film's second perspective. If Hammer anchors Citizen Vigilante from the inside, from the perspective of the vigilante himself, then Costas Mandylor provides the film's necessary counterweight. As Interpol Regional Chief Henry, Mandylor represents the institutional order that Sanders has placed himself in opposition to. And crucially, the film does not make him a villain. This is one of the screenplay's most thoughtful decisions. It would have been easy to present Henry as corrupt, incompetent or simply unsympathetic, thereby giving the audience clean moral permission to root against him and cheer for Sanders without reservation. But Citizen Vigilante resists that temptation. Henry is a man doing his job. He believes in the rule of law. He believes that the systems he represents, however imperfect, are preferable to a world in which individuals take justice into their own hands based on personal conviction. That position is reasonable. It is, in fact, the position that most of civilized society is built upon. What makes the Henry-Sanders conflict so interesting is that both men can be argued to be right, depending on which set of values you bring to the cinema. Henry is right that a society in which private citizens act as judge, jury and executioner is a dangerous society, one in which the definition of justice depends entirely on the conscience and reliability of whoever holds the weapon. Sanders is right that a society in which formal justice repeatedly fails the vulnerable, in which money and influence determine outcomes and ordinary people are left without recourse, is equally dangerous and perhaps more insidiously so. The film puts these two arguments into direct collision through its two lead characters, and neither argument is definitively resolved. Mandylor gives Henry a solidity and a dignity that makes him a worthy foil for Hammer's Sanders. The scenes in which the two men's paths come closest to intersecting are among the film's most tense, precisely because both performances communicate genuine conviction. Neither character is simply going through the motions. Both believe they are right, and the audience is left to decide who they agree with. Action sequences, B-movie energy, real-world grounding. Citizen Vigilante does not pretend to be a prestige action film. It knows exactly what it is, a B-movie thriller with things to say, and within that framework, it delivers action sequences that are considerably more effective than its genre classification might suggest. The confrontations in the film are direct, grounded and purposeful. Boll and his team have chosen to emphasize realism over spectacle, which is the right call for this material. When Sanders engages criminals or pursues targets, the action feels consequential. There is an efficiency to the violence that communicates something about the characters. Military training and mindset without ever becoming gratuitous. Sanders does not enjoy what he does. He does it because he believes it needs to be done, and the action choreography reflects that attitude. This approach also means that the film's action sequences integrate naturally into the broader narrative rather than feeling like set pieces parachuted in for their own sake. Each confrontation advances the story, deepens our understanding of Sanders' methods and motivations, or escalates the stakes of his ongoing mission. The action serves the film rather than dominating it. There are moments of genuine kinetic energy, sequences where the editing and pacing come together to create real tension, but the film never loses its essential seriousness in pursuit of them. This is not an action film that wants you to forget what it is about. It is an action film that uses its genre conventions as a vehicle for delivering a message it considers urgent. The balance between those two objectives is well maintained throughout. Timeliness and themes, why this film arrives at exactly the right moment. It is impossible to watch Citizen Vigilante without being struck by how precisely it maps onto contemporary concerns. The issues the film explores, declining public trust in institutions, the perception that justice is selectively available, the frustration of ordinary people who feel abandoned by the systems theoretically designed to serve them, are not abstract or historical. They are the issues that fill headlines, drive political movements and generate genuine social anxiety across the Western world right now. Boll has never been a subtle filmmaker, and Citizen Vigilante does not pretend to subtlety. The film knows what it wants to say, and it says it loudly and without apology. But that directness, which has sometimes worked against Boll in the past, is entirely appropriate here. This is not a film that benefits from hedging. The strength of its impact depends on its willingness to commit fully to its perspective, to put its argument on the screen and defend it. The film also benefits from the fact that its argument is not ideologically simple. Vigilantism as a response to institutional failure is not exclusively a right-wing or left-wing idea. It is an idea that emerges from a particular kind of frustration, one that exists across the political spectrum whenever institutions are perceived to have failed their core functions. Citizen Vigilante is careful not to reduce its message to simple partisan politics. Sanders' targets are defined by what he perceives as their personal crimes, not their political affiliations. His frustration is with a system, not a party. That breadth of critique makes the film more interesting and more challenging than a straightforward political polemic would be. For viewers paying attention to the state of the world in 2026, the film's central thesis, that governments ignore public concerns at their own peril, will land with considerable force. Whether that thesis is correct, whether vigilantism offers any real answer to the problems it identifies, is a question the film raises but wisely declines to answer for its audience. That decision leaves the debate where it belongs, in the minds and conversations of the people who have watched it. The Germany controversy, banned, and better for it. The most striking piece of context surrounding Citizen Vigilante is that it has been banned in Germany. For a certain kind of viewer, and there are many of them, that information alone will be the most compelling recommendation the film could possibly receive. There is a long and not entirely glorious tradition of banning films for political reasons, and the history of those bans is instructive. Films that challenge established narratives, that question the competence or honesty of institutional power, or that present perspectives deemed too dangerous for public consumption, have always attracted the attention of authorities. Sometimes those bans are justified by legitimate concerns. Often, however, they represent exactly the kind of institutional overreach that the films themselves are criticizing. Whether the German ban on Citizen Vigilante falls into the former or latter category is a matter for individual viewers to assess. What can be said with confidence is that the ban has dramatically increased interest in the film, and that it has transformed what might otherwise have been a notable but limited B-movie release into an international conversation. In the current media environment, banning a film is probably the single most effective promotional strategy a distributor could employ. The controversy surrounding Citizen Vigilante has ensured that it will be seen by audiences who would never have sought it out otherwise, and that those audiences will bring to it a heightened sense of engagement.
Production values and direction, working within limitations. Citizen Vigilante is a modestly budgeted film, and it would be dishonest to suggest otherwise. The production values do not compete with major studio releases, and there are moments where the limitations of the budget are visible in ways that more well-resourced productions would have smoothed over. But those limitations rarely undermine the film's effectiveness, and in some respects they actively serve it. The lean production aesthetic contributes to the film's documentary quality. When the locations feel genuinely European rather than studio-constructed, when the cinematography prioritizes functional clarity over visual showboating, and when the action is staged for impact rather than impressiveness, the result is a film that feels grounded in the real world in a way that higher-budget productions sometimes struggle to achieve. The constraints of the budget have, paradoxically, pushed the film towards stylistic choices that suit its subject matter well. Boll directs with a focus and clarity of purpose that is evident throughout. Whatever criticisms have been leveled at his work in the past, Citizen Vigilante shows a filmmaker in control of his material and determined to serve the story he wants to tell. The pacing is measured without being slow, the performances are well managed, and the central argument is given space to develop rather than being rushed or oversimplified. This is the work of a director who knows exactly what film he is making and has made it with conviction. Criticism and context, the only significant negative. The most substantive negative criticism that can be leveled at Citizen Vigilante is, ironically, not about the film itself. It is about the restrictions that have been placed upon it. The German ban, and a possibility of similar restrictions in other territories, creates a real risk that audiences who would find the film genuinely engaging and genuinely provocative in the best sense will simply not have access to it. This is a frustrating situation, but it is also worth noting that the response to restrictions on film in the modern era is rarely the elimination of the film. Banning a film in the streaming age is a fundamentally different proposition from banning it in the era of physical distribution. Citizen Vigilante will find its audience, and the controversy surrounding its restrictions will almost certainly ensure that the audience it finds is larger, more engaged and more vocal than it would have been had the film been allowed to circulate without interference. The irony of attempts to suppress a film about the failure of institutions is not lost on anyone paying attention. Those attempts have, if anything, strengthened the film's central argument. When authorities move to restrict a work of art for political reasons, they are demonstrating precisely the kind of institutional behavior that the work is challenging. Citizen Vigilante could not have asked for a more effective demonstration of its own thesis. Essential, provocative, and precisely on time, Citizen Vigilante is an excellent and deeply timely film. It works as a vigilante thriller, delivering solid performances, effective action and a narrative that holds together from its fractured opening to its inevitable conclusion. But it works most powerfully as a provocation, as an act of filmmaking that takes a position, defends it under pressure and trusts its audience to engage with the debate it is opening rather than simply consuming and moving on. Armie Hammer delivers career-relevant work as Sanders, grounding the film's argument in a fully realized human performance. Costas Mandylor provides the necessary counterbalance with an equally committed portrayal of institutional legitimacy in the face of individual challenge. Boll, working with clear purpose and genuine conviction, brings it all together in a film that proves what modest budgets and strong material can achieve when a filmmaker is truly invested in what he is doing. The film's central message, that governments ignore public concerns at their own peril, is delivered with a confidence and a clarity that makes it impossible to dismiss, regardless of where individual viewers stand on the issues it raises. In an era when the relationship between citizens and institutions is being renegotiated in real time, Citizen Vigilante arrives not as escapism but as commentary. Not as a fantasy of justice but as a question about what justice is, who it serves and what happens when ordinary people conclude that the answer is not them.